There is a question most people never say out loud. You have been faithful. You have done the work nobody asked you to do. You have shown up when walking away would have been easier. You have prayed the same prayer so many times you have lost count. And somewhere in the quiet, in the space between what God promised and what your life actually looks like right now, a question has started forming. What is taking so long? That is the question. And if you have ever felt it, you already know why David's life matters. The real David. The one who was chosen years before he was enthroned. The one who served the man who was trying to kill him. The one who wrote songs in caves and wept over children he could not save and sinned in ways that cost people he loved everything. That David. Most people think the point of his story is that God rewards the faithful with what they are waiting for. But the life of David teaches something far more uncomfortable than that. The waiting is not the obstacle. The waiting is the curriculum. And what God builds in a person during that time is worth more than anything he could hand them at the beginning. But here is the thing most people miss entirely. David's most dangerous season was not the years before the crown. It was what happened after the crown finally came. That is the part that changes everything. And that is the part we are going to walk through together. We are not going to move through these 40 lessons like a checklist. David's life was not a checklist. These lessons come as fields and caves, as songs written in the dark, as friendships that cost more than they should, as failures that landed in places nobody expected, and as a grace that kept showing up after every single one of them. 9 chapters, 40 lessons, one life that God refused to give up on. And by the time we reach the end, you will have walked through every one of them. Let us begin where God always begins, not with the throne, with the field. The field gives us the first 5 lessons, and none of them feel like lessons when they are happening. They feel like ordinary days. The day everything changed for David. He was not there for it. That is the detail most people read past. Samuel the prophet arrived in Bethlehem with a horn of oil and a specific assignment from God. He went to the house of Jesse because God had chosen one of Jesse's sons to be the next king of Israel. And Jesse, doing what any father would do, gathered his sons and brought them forward. All of them, except one. David was in the field, watching sheep. He was out there because nobody thought to include him. When Jesse lined up his sons before the most important visitor his family had ever received, David did not make the list. 7 sons walked past Samuel. 7 times God said no. And then Samuel asked the question that must have landed strangely in that room. Are these all your sons? And Jesse answered the way people answer when they have not thought carefully about the question. There is still the youngest. He is keeping the sheep. The youngest, keeping the sheep, said the way you mentioned something you almost forgot. Go get him. Samuel said, we will not sit down until he arrives. Think about what was happening in that field while all of this was going on. David did not know. He was doing his job, the same job he had been doing every day, with no audience and no applause and no indication that any of it was leading anywhere. Watching sheep on an ordinary afternoon, on what looked like an ordinary day, with no reason to believe it was anything other than that. And God was watching him. The first lesson the field teaches is the one most people spend years trying to learn: the preparation that matters most never feels like preparation when it is happening. It feels like your regular life. It feels like the field. It feels like another day of doing the thing nobody is celebrating, in the place nobody is looking. for reasons that have not yet become clear to anyone, including you. Jesse's decision to leave David out of the lineup was not malicious. It was the quiet, ordinary assumption that some people are not the kind of people certain things happen to. David was young. David was the youngest. David had sheep to watch. The idea that God might have already decided something about this boy would not have occurred to Jesse. It barely occurred to Samuel, who had to be corrected by God before he made the same mistake. Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That correction was necessary. Even the prophet needed it, because the pull toward the obvious, the tall one, the impressive one, the one who looks the part, is not a human weakness that faith automatically eliminates. It is a human instinct that faith has to continually challenge. David ran in from the field. The text says he was ruddy, with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. But the thing God pointed to was none of that. The Lord said, "Arise and anoint him, for this is he." And Samuel poured the oil. And then David went back to the sheep. That part does not get preached often enough. He went back. The oil was on his head, and the calling was real, and the prophet had come and gone, and David returned to the field. Because the anointing was not the arrival. It was the beginning of a longer preparation that would not look like preparation for a very long time. The second lesson is quieter but goes deeper. The skills that carry you into your public moments are almost always built in your private ones. The harp playing that would eventually bring David into Saul's court did not appear from nowhere. It was practiced in a place where nobody was grading it. The accuracy with a sling that would one day determine the outcome of a battle was developed against threats that nobody witnessed. A lion came for the sheep. David killed it. A bear came. David killed that too. No crowd, no record, no reward except the knowledge that he had done what needed to be done because it needed to be done. The private ones do not feel important while they are happening. They feel like maintenance. They feel like the low-stakes version of the real thing. But there is no low-stakes version. Every moment of faithfulness in the small thing is building something in you that the big moment will require. The third lesson is the one Samuel himself had to be corrected to understand. God does not evaluate people by the same measurements we do. Height, appearance, birth order, the opinions of the people who know you best. None of those are the criteria. The heart is the criteria. And the heart is the one thing that cannot be faked in the field, when nobody is watching and a lion is coming toward the flock. The fourth lesson shows up in the detail that David was a shepherd before he was anything else. The person who has not learned to care for what is small and vulnerable will not know how to care for what is large and powerful. Every king David would eventually become was first shaped by what he did for sheep that could not advocate for themselves. The fifth lesson is the hardest one. For most people to sit with, being overlooked by the people closest to you is not the same as being forgotten by God. Jesse did not call his son. The person who should have seen David's potential, who had the most proximity and the most reason to believe in him, did not. For many people, the deepest wound is not that the world overlooked them. It is that the people closest to them did. The parent who did not believe, the mentor who never invested, the community that assigned them a role and never looked past it. David knows that wound. He lived inside it. And the God who told Samuel to go get the boy from the field is the same God who has not forgotten where he put you, even if the people who should have remembered have not thought to look. The field teaches us this: obscurity is not the opposite of calling. Sometimes it is the first classroom of calling. What no one sees is often where God builds what everyone will one day need. The giant gives us the next 5 lessons, but only if you start the story in the right place. And most people start it in the wrong place. Everyone remembers the valley. The 2 armies camped on opposite hills with the valley of Elah between them. The Philistine champion stepping forward every morning for 40 days. The armor, the height, the bronze helmet, and the spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam. The whole army of Israel standing there. The text says, dismayed and greatly afraid, 40 days of paralysis. 40 days of the same giant saying the same thing, and not one man in the army of God willing to take a step forward. And then a teenager arrived with bread and cheese for his brothers. What happened next is one of the most famous confrontations in human history. But the valley was not where David's courage was formed. The valley was just where it became visible. Go back earlier in the text. David standing in front of Saul, making the case that he should be allowed to fight. And Saul saying what everyone was thinking. You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. Reasonable, logical, the kind of thing a responsible leader says. And David's response is the one that tells you everything about how public courage actually works. He did not argue strategy. He did not present credentials. He told a story about a lion and a bear. Your servant was tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and attacked him, and rescued the lamb from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Nobody was there for that. There was no crowd, no record, no reward, just a shepherd, a predator, and a choice about what kind of person David was going to be when no one was watching. And he made that choice not once, but multiple times, quietly, in a field, in front of an audience of sheep. The 6th lesson is the one the valley makes impossible to miss. Courage is usually memory under pressure. What looks like a sudden act of bravery in public is almost always the product of a long series of smaller acts of faithfulness in private. David was courageous in the valley because he had been practicing trust in the field long enough that it had become the default response of his heart. When everyone else was calculating odds, David was pulling from memory. The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. That is not optimism. That is theology built through experience. He had seen God show up in an actual moment when his life was actually at risk and the outcome was not guaranteed. The giant was bigger. The audience was larger. The God had not changed. There is something else in this passage that almost always gets overlooked. When Saul tried to help, he put his own armor on David. His tunic, his coat of mail, his bronze helmet, his sword, and David tried to walk in it. He tried to walk, the text says, for he had not tested them. And then he took them off. He said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. The 7th lesson lives right here. The armor of another person's calling will not protect you in your battle. What Saul had built his confidence on was not wrong for Saul. It was just not David's. And David was secure enough in who he was and how God had prepared him to refuse the borrowed equipment even when it was offered by the king. The pressure to use the framework that worked for the person in front of you is enormous. The pressure to imitate the success of people you respect, to adopt their methods, and their way of walking into the valley is one of the most consistent temptations that faces anyone who has a calling. David, before anyone had given him a reason to trust his own preparation, said, "No. What God built in me for my battles will be enough for this one." He took his staff, his sling, 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he ran toward Goliath. Run. Not walked, not advanced carefully. Run. A person runs like that towards something that has terrified an entire army for 40 days only when they are running towards something they already know. Something proven true in a field when no one was watching, and the stakes were a single lamb and a lion, that nobody would have blamed him for letting go. The 8th lesson is the one Goliath himself teaches without knowing it. The giants we face are rarely just our personal problem. Goliath was not only David's obstacle. He was the thing that exposed what the whole army of Israel was actually trusting. 40 days of paralysis said more about the spiritual condition of Israel than it said about the size of Goliath. When one person with a different kind of trust walks into a situation that has paralyzed everyone else, it does not just solve the immediate problem. It reveals the deeper one. Goliath fell. The stone found its mark. And the lesson that followed the victory is the 9th one. The one nobody talks about on the Sunday morning version of this story. One victory does not end the testing. It opens the next chapter of it. Because what came after the valley is the part that changes everything. The crowd began to cheer. The women of Israel came out to celebrate, and they sang, "Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And inside the palace, a man stood at the window, listening to the sound of his own name being sung less than the name of the boy who had just won his battle for him. The 10th lesson is already visible in that moment. Though it will take years to fully unfold, a season of public victory almost always awakens something in the people around you that private preparation never did. The field prepared David to face the giant. The victory over the giant prepared David for something harder. Being in proximity to a person who is afraid of what you carry. The giant was not the first test. It was the last easy one. The palace gives us the next 5 lessons, and every single one of them comes wrapped in pain. David walked into the palace as a hero. He left as a fugitive. The distance between those two things was not years of slow decline. It was the space between one song and the next, between the crowd celebrating outside and the king standing at the window counting the words. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Saul heard it, and something in him shifted permanently. The text does not dress it up. Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. And from that day on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. From that day on, the decision was made in a moment, and then it hardened into something that would drive every choice Saul made for the rest of his life. What happened next is one of the strangest dynamics in all of Scripture. David did not leave. He stayed. He continued to serve the man who had just decided to be afraid of him. He played the harp in Saul's court. He led Saul's armies. He won battle after battle and brought honor to a king who was quietly plotting his destruction. And the better David performed, the more Saul wanted him gone. The 11th lesson lives right here, and it is one of the most painful truths in the entire story. Sometimes the person you are called to serve becomes the person who fears what God placed in you. There is a word for what Saul was experiencing, and it goes deeper than jealousy. It was the particular terror of a person in a position they know they no longer deserve, watching someone else carry the thing that was taken from them. Saul had been anointed. Saul had been filled with the Spirit. Saul had been given everything David was now walking into, and he had lost it. Not to an enemy, not to a rival, but to his own disobedience and his own fear. And now here was this boy from Bethlehem carrying what Saul used to carry, doing it effortlessly. Being loved by everyone, Saul needed to love him. And there was nothing Saul could do about any of it except become increasingly consumed by the need to destroy what he could not control. The first attempt was not subtle. Saul had a spear in his hand. David was playing the harp, and Saul threw it. Twice. And David escaped from him twice. Read that again. Twice. David did not leave after the first attempt. He was still in the room, still playing, still serving. The man had thrown a weapon at him, and David was still showing up to do his job. This is the part that makes modern readers uncomfortable, because the obvious advice is to leave immediately. Get out of the room. Get out of the palace. Get away from the man who is trying to kill you. And eventually David does leave, but not immediately. And the reason he stayed as long as he did reveals the 12th lesson. There are seasons when God keeps you in a difficult place, not because he cannot move you, but because what he is building in you requires the resistance. David was learning what it cost to honor someone who did not deserve it. He continued to serve with integrity in a situation that was deteriorating around him. He refused to let Saul's ugliness become the justification for his own. And he watched carefully what happens to a leader when insecurity becomes the organizing principle of their life. He was watching a case study in what he never wanted to become. Because Saul did not start this way. When Samuel first found him, Saul hid among the baggage because he did not feel worthy of the honor being given to him. He was humble. He was reluctant. He had the Spirit of God on him. But somewhere along the way, the weight of the position and the fear of losing it began to change him from the inside. The insecurity that had once made him humble now made him paranoid. The need for approval that had once kept him appropriately dependent on God now made him dangerous to everyone around him. He became a man who needed the crowd more than he needed God. And when the crowd started singing someone else's name, there was nothing left in him that could absorb the loss. David watched all of this from inside the palace. He watched a gifted man become consumed by what he was afraid of losing. He watched a king who had everything use his power to chase the one person who was not actually his enemy. He watched what happened when a leader stopped trusting God and started managing threats. When every decision became about self-preservation instead of faithfulness. When the anointing was present in memory but absent in practice. The 13th lesson is the one this entire season of David's life was building toward the person who has been wounded by someone else's insecure. Leadership carries a responsibility to learn from that wound rather than repeat it. David saw Saul use power to silence the people who told him the truth. David felt the cost of that. David paid the price for it. And David would carry every one of those lessons into his own kingship. Whether he remembered them when it mattered most is something we will come back to. Saul is still in rooms today. He sits in church leadership and corporate offices and family dynamics. He wears different faces, but the pattern is always the same. The insecurity that masquerades as authority. The control that presents itself as protection. The fear dressed up in the language of discernment. If you have ever served someone like that, you already know this chapter is not just ancient history. In the middle of all of this, something else was happening that the story of Saul almost crowds out entirely. David had a friend. Jonathan was Saul's son, the crown prince, the man who, by every conventional expectation, should have been David's rival. The throne that God had promised to David was the throne that Jonathan had every human reason to want for himself. And Jonathan knew this. He understood the spiritual dynamics clearly enough to say to David, "You will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you." And then he made a covenant with David, because he loved him as he loved his own soul. What Jonathan did is almost impossible to fully absorb. He gave David his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, his belt. In the ancient Near East, these were not gifts. They were symbols of identity and position. Jonathan was saying with his actions what was almost too costly to say with words. What God has placed on you matters more to me than what should have been mine. I will not compete with your calling. I will protect it. The 14th lesson is the one Jonathan's life makes undeniable. Real friendship does not compete with what God has placed on your life. It covers it. Jonathan lost his future to love David well, and he never once made David feel guilty about it. There is a moment near the end of this season when David has finally fled the palace and is hiding in a field. When Jonathan comes to him one last time, the text says Jonathan strengthened his hand in God, not his resolve, not his confidence in the strategy, his hand in God. Jonathan knew what David needed was not more information about Saul's plans. He needed to be reconnected to the source that had called him and sustained him. And Jonathan gave him that. In a field, in secret, at personal risk. They made a covenant together. They wept together. And then Jonathan went home to his father's house. He died at the Battle of Mount Gilboa, fighting in the army of the man who had spent years trying to kill his closest friend. When David heard the news, he tore his clothes and mourned and wept and fasted. And then he wrote one of the most beautiful laments in all of Scripture, "How the mighty have fallen. Jonathan lies slain on the high places. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary." Jonathan was gone, and with him went the person who had seen David most clearly, who had loved him most freely, who had given the most costly thing a person can give. The 15th lesson comes from watching the full arc of this friendship. The people God sends to walk alongside you in your hardest seasons are not there by accident. They are placed. They carry what you cannot carry alone. And when they go, the question they leave behind is whether you learned to hold what they carried, or whether you were only holding it through them. The palace teaches us this: the most dangerous person in your life is rarely the one who opposes you openly. It is the one who needs what God placed in you, but cannot survive what your gift reveals about the difference between you. And the rarest gift God sends in those seasons is a person who sees what God has placed on your life and chooses to honor it over everything they stand to lose. David went deeper into the wilderness, and the wilderness was about to give him something neither the field nor the palace ever could. The cave gives us 7 lessons, and none of them are easy. Every single one of them has to be learned the hard way. David arrived at the cave of Adullam with nothing. No army, no title, no palace, no protection. The anointing was real, but the throne was occupied by someone who wanted him dead. And the future that God had spoken over his life looked, from the inside of that cave, like something that might have been a mistake. He had lost everything the world uses to tell a person they are on the right track. And in the absence of all of it, he wrote this: "I cry out to God Most High, to God who fulfills his purpose for me. He will send from heaven and save me. God will send out his steadfast love and his faithfulness." Present tense. Active. Desperate. The Psalms, traditionally connected to this season, are not the polished theology of a man who has arrived somewhere safe. They are the raw and reaching words of a man in a cave who has chosen to believe what he cannot yet see. Not because it is easy, but because the alternative is to be consumed by what surrounds him. And then people started showing up. Everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. There were about 400 men. The 16th lesson arrives with those 400 people. God often fills your cave before he fills your palace. And the people he sends to the cave are almost never the people you would have chosen. These were not trained warriors or proven commanders. These were the broken ones, the ones the system had failed, or the ones who had failed themselves. Men in debt, which in that culture often meant men who had lost everything: land, family, dignity. Men in distress, men who were bitter, men who had nowhere else to go. And they went to David. They went because David was the only person they could find who was outside the system that had broken them, and outside it in a way that made him feel like someone who might understand what it meant to be discarded. David did not ask for these people. He did not recruit them. They simply appeared, drawn by something in his situation that resonated with something in theirs. And David had to make a choice about what kind of leader he was going to be before he had any of the things that are normally associated with leadership. The 17th lesson is the one the 400 men teach without knowing it. Leadership capacity is not developed in ideal conditions. It is developed in the cave, with the people nobody else wanted. Before you have any of the resources or recognition that make leadership feel legitimate, the 400 men who came to Adullam became, over time, the most loyal and capable fighting force in David's story. They are called David's mighty men. Their individual acts of courage and devotion fill pages of the historical record. But they started as a group of desperate, broken, unwanted people in a cave. What turned them into mighty men was not a training program. It was years of being led by someone who had learned to lead without any of the conventional resources of leadership. Now there is a chapter inside this chapter that has to be told carefully, because it is the most theologically loaded moment in the entire wilderness season. Twice, David had the opportunity to kill Saul. Twice, he chose not to. The first time, David and his men were in the depths of a cave at En-Gedi when Saul entered the same cave. Alone, unaware that the man he had been hunting for years was sitting in the shadows watching him. David's men whispered the obvious interpretation. "Here is the day the Lord said to you, 'Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you.'" That reading made complete sense. It sounded like providence. It looked like God opening a door. The enemy, vulnerable, in the dark, with no witnesses and no way to defend himself. David crept forward. He cut a corner of Saul's robe. And then the text says something remarkable. Afterward, David's heart struck him. His conscience was activated not by a violent act, but by a small, symbolic one. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." The 18th lesson is here, and it is one of the most important in the entire story, taking what God has not yet given you, even when it is within reach. Even when every circumstance seems to be arranging itself in your favor, is not faith. It is theft dressed in spiritual language. David did not spare Saul because he was naive about the threat. He knew exactly what Saul was. He had lived inside the reality of Saul's murderous intent for years. He spared Saul because he understood that his role was not to accelerate what God was doing. His role was to trust the timeline. There will be moments in your life when something is within reach, when the path to what you have been promised looks like it runs through a choice that would require you to take it before it is given. The circumstances will feel arranged. The people around you will offer you theological justifications for moving forward. And the thing that tells you whether it is really God opening the door or just an opportunity that looks like God is this: does taking it require you to compromise the thing that has kept you who you are throughout the waiting? David walked out of that cave. He called to Saul from a distance and showed him the corner of cloth. And Saul wept. He said, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil." It was a moment of genuine clarity for Saul, and it lasted exactly as long as such moments of clarity last for people who have not dealt with the deeper issue. He went home, and the Zabta records him pursuing David again. The second time David spared Saul, in the wilderness of Ziph. David crept into the camp at night while Saul and his army slept. His companion asked for permission to pin Saul to the ground with his own spear. "Just once," he said. "I will not strike him twice." David said no. Again. The 19th lesson is the one this second moment of restraint makes undeniable. The first time might have been principle. The second time is character. What you do once under pressure is a decision. What you do twice is the revelation of who you have become. David was becoming someone who could hold the promise without grabbing it. Someone who could be in proximity to the power he had been told was coming and trust God enough to leave it alone until God moved. That is not a natural posture for a human being. It is built. It costs something, and it takes longer than one cave and one opportunity resisted. Woven through all of these events was something happening in David's interior life that would outlast everything else in his story. He was writing. The Psalms, traditionally associated with this period, are among the most honest pieces of writing in human history. David did not sanitize his experience for public consumption. He wrote about feeling abandoned. He wrote about enemies surrounding him on every side. He wrote about the silence of God in seasons when he needed to hear a word and heard nothing. He wrote about fear and rage and exhaustion and the specific loneliness of being a person who believes in a God who does not seem to be doing anything about the current situation. And then, in the same breath, he wrote about trust. "When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" The 20th lesson lives in that tension. Faith is not the absence of honest struggle. It is the decision to trust in the middle of it. The Psalms from this season were not written after the fear passed. They were written inside the fear. David did not wait until he had it figured out before he talked to God. He talked to God in the process of trying to figure it out. And that posture, the posture of a person who brings the unsorted and still bleeding parts of their experience to God without cleaning them up first, is one of the most transferable things in the entire story. The 21st lesson comes from looking at what the cave produced over time. The waiting years are not empty time. God is not on pause while you are in the cave. He is building the kind of soul that can survive the promise. The field prepared David to face a giant. The palace prepared him to understand power. But the cave prepared him for something no external environment could have produced. It built in him the knowledge of who he was when everything was stripped away. and the knowledge of who God was when there was nothing to praise him for except his own faithfulness. The 22nd lesson is perhaps the quietest one of the 7, but it is the one that holds all the others together. The people God gives you in your cave. The broken and the discarded and the ones nobody else wanted. They are not the obstacle to your calling. They are the first part of it. And what you do with them before anyone is watching will determine what you become when everyone is. The cave teaches us this: waiting is not empty time. It is where God tests whether a person can hold the promise without grabbing it. And the soul that survives the cave intact is the only kind of soul that can survive the crown. The crown was coming. But first, there were things God still needed to do. A woman on a donkey riding hard down a mountain road to stop an army that had no idea it needed to be stopped. And an old prophet whose presence had been quietly holding something together that David would not understand until it was gone. This chapter gives us 4 lessons, and every one of them arrives through a person God placed in David's path at exactly the moment David needed them most. David almost made a terrible mistake. Not the kind that gets discussed much in Sunday sermons. Not the dramatic failure that everyone knows is coming later in his story. This was a quieter one, a more understandable one. The kind of mistake that feels completely justified in the moment because the anger behind it is completely legitimate. A wealthy man named Nabal had flocks and herds in the region of Carmel. David and his men had been in that area for some time, and during that time they had functioned as an informal protection force for Nabal's shepherds. Nobody asked them to. Nobody paid them to. But the wilderness was dangerous, and David's men had made sure that Nabal's people and Nabal's livestock came to no harm. It was a genuine service, freely given. When shearing season came, which was a time of celebration and generosity in that culture, David sent 10 young men to Nabal with a respectful request. They identified themselves, explained what they had done, and asked if Nabal might share whatever he could spare from his abundance. Nabal's response was contemptuous. "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" He knew exactly who David was. Everyone in that region knew. This was not ignorance. This was a deliberate and public insult from a man who had calculated that he was powerful enough to disrespect the man God had anointed as the next king of Israel and face no consequences. David's response was immediate. He told his men to strap on their swords. He was going to kill every male in Nabal's household before morning. 400 men moving toward one household with weapons drawn. And the anger was not irrational. David had given something real. It had been dismissed without acknowledgement. In a culture where honor was one of the primary currencies of survival, what Nabal did was a declaration that David was nobody, that his protection meant nothing, that he could be treated with contempt and there would be no cost. David had been running from Saul for years. He had resisted the temptation to take matters into his own hands again and again. And now a wealthy fool in Carmel was going to treat him like a fugitive with no claim to basic dignity. The rage was earned. The sword was already moving. What stopped him was a woman on a donkey coming down a mountain with 200 loaves of bread. Abigail was Nabal's wife. One of the servants had told her what her husband had done and what was coming, and she had not waited for permission or instruction. She loaded everything she could find onto donkeys and rode out to intercept David before he reached the house. She did not send a messenger. She went herself. And when she saw David, she fell at his feet and said something that required more wisdom than most people carry in a lifetime. She did not defend Nabal. She did not explain him or apologize for him or ask David to consider his perspective. She said, "On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt." And then she said the thing that actually stopped the army. "Please let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow, Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." And then she turned to what David actually needed to hear. Not about Nabal, but about David himself. "The Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. And evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself." She was not flattering him. She was reminding him of who he was and what was at stake. She was saying, in language precise enough to land through the noise of his anger, that the thing he was about to do would follow him, that the man who had resisted taking the throne by force, who had spared the Lord's anointed twice, who had built his entire story around trusting God's timing, was about to massacre a household over an insult. And when the throne finally came, he would sit on it with that night attached to him. David stopped. He said, "Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand." Working salvation with my own hand. That phrase is worth carrying far beyond this story. It describes the specific temptation of a person who has been waiting so long, who has been treated so unjustly, who has been given every human reason to stop trusting the process and start forcing the outcome. The temptation is not to do something obviously evil. The temptation is to do something that feels completely justified and just happens to put you in the place of God. The 23rd lesson is the one Abigail makes unavoidable. God sometimes saves you from yourself by sending someone who has no formal authority over you, but carries exactly the word you need to hear at exactly the moment you are most resistant to hearing it. She arrived uninvited, at personal risk, with no guarantee that her intervention would be welcomed. And she carried something that David needed more than he needed an army. She carried a word that reconnected him to who he was before the rage took over. Pay close attention to who those people are in your own life. They do not always look like what you expect wisdom to look like. Sometimes they arrive on a donkey with bread when what you think you need is someone to validate your sword. Nabal died 10 days later. David sent for Abigail, and she became his wife. The resolution came quickly in the text, but the lesson lives in the moment before the resolution. When David was 400 armed men into a decision he could not undo, and one person, who was not even on his side, had enough clarity and enough courage to ride out alone and say what he needed to hear. Now there is a second thing God did in this season that almost nobody talks about. And it is the one that shows how quietly dangerous the wilderness years were becoming. Samuel died. That sentence in the text is brief. All Israel assembled and mourned for him and buried him at his home in Ramah. And then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. 2 sentences, back to back. The prophet is buried and David goes deeper into the desert. The text does not tell us there is a direct connection between these 2 events. But the sequence carries weight that is worth sitting with honestly. Samuel was the one human being alive who carried the clearest external confirmation of what God had spoken over David's life. He was the prophet who had poured the oil. He had walked into Jesse's house and asked for the boy in the field. He had anointed David when nobody else in the room understood what was happening. And now he was gone. The 24th lesson arrives with Samuel's death. There is something about the presence of a person who carries the word of God over your life that stabilizes things in ways you do not fully understand until they are no longer there. The promise does not go with them when they go. God does not rescind what he has spoken, because the human messenger is no longer present. But the absence creates a particular kind of vulnerability, a quiet unmooring. The voice that used to externally confirm the internal conviction is silent now. And in that silence, a person is left alone with what they actually believe when there is nothing and no one reinforcing it. David had to learn to carry the word without Samuel. He had to discover, in the hardest possible way, that the promise was not located in the prophet. It was located in the God who had spoken it. The people God sends are not always the ones who stay. Some of them are given for a season, to carry what we cannot carry alone at a specific moment, to say the word we need to hear at the exact moment we need to hear it, and then to go. Abigail rode out to stop something that would have destroyed David's story before it reached its turning point. Samuel had poured the oil that started the story. Both of them played their part, and both of them were gone before the crown arrived. The 25th lesson is the one this reality makes unavoidable. You were not made to carry the calling alone, but you were also not made to be dependent on any one person's presence to keep believing. The ones God sends are meant to point you back to God, not to replace him. And when they go, the question they leave behind is whether you learned to hold what they carried, or whether you were only holding it through them. There was one more test waiting before the crown came into view, and it came not from an enemy outside. It came from inside his own camp. On a day when everything he had built in the wilderness was reduced to ashes, and the men standing next to him were talking about killing him. That day had a name, and the 26th lesson lives inside it. David came back to Ziklag and found ashes. The Amalekites had raided while he and his men were away. They had taken everything: the wives, the children, the possessions, the livestock, the life that 400 broken men had built together in the wilderness over years of shared hardship. All of it gone. The camp was burned to the ground, and the men who had followed David through caves and deserts and years of exile stood in the ruins of what they had and turned on the only person left to blame. The people spoke of stoning him. David, the man they had followed, the man who had held them together through everything, in the worst moment of collective grief any of them had ever experienced. They looked for somewhere to put the weight of it and landed on their leader. This is what leadership looks like at its most tested. Not when everything is working and the victories are coming and the men are loyal. This is what it looks like when the camp is ash and the children are gone and the people you have given years of your life to are talking about killing you. And David did something in that moment that defines everything that comes after it. The text says, he strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He went to the only place left, and he came back from that place with a question. Shall I pursue this raiding party? Shall I overtake them? God said, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. David pursued. He recovered everything, every person, every animal, everything that had been taken. And when some of his men argued that the 200 who had been too exhausted to continue the pursuit should not share in the spoils, David refused. He established a statute and a rule from that day forward. Those who stay with the supplies share equally with those who go into the battle. He made policy in the ruins of Ziklag that protected the people who had not been strong enough to fight. Before he had a throne, before he had a kingdom, before anyone was required to listen to him. The 26th lesson is the one Ziklag burns into the story permanently. The final examination before God gives you the thing he promised is almost always the moment when you have the least reason to trust him and the most reason to take matters into your own hands. What David did at Ziklag, strengthening himself in God when every external support had collapsed, was not a dramatic act of visible faith. It was a quiet decision made in the ruins, and it was the truest preview of the king he was about to become. The people God sends teach us this: you were not made to carry the calling alone. But the calling itself will eventually bring you to a moment when every person God sent is either gone or turning against you. And what you do in that moment, where you go to find strength when there is nowhere left to go, that is the thing that tells you and God and everyone watching exactly who you have become in the waiting. The crown gives us 5 lessons, and 4 of them are beautiful. The 5th one is the most dangerous lesson in the entire story. Saul died at Mount Gilboa, Jonathan with him, and the long chapter of the wilderness came to its end. David was 30 years old when he came to Hebron, and the men of Judah anointed him king over the house of Judah. Not all of Israel yet, just Judah. The promise that Samuel had spoken over a teenage shepherd was beginning to take shape, but it was taking shape slowly, partially, incompletely. 7 years and 6 months in Hebron before the rest of Israel came. 7 years of being king of part of what God had promised before the whole thing came together. The 27th lesson arrives in those 7 years at Hebron. The fulfillment of a long promise rarely arrives the way you imagined it. It comes in stages. It comes in pieces. It comes partially and incompletely, and requiring the same faithfulness in the partial as it required in the waiting. Most people, when they imagine receiving what God promised, imagine it arriving completely and all at once. David's experience was different, and the 7 years at Hebron were God's way of asking one final question before the full weight of the promise was transferred. Can you steward the partial with the same integrity you brought to the cave? When all the elders of Israel finally came to Hebron and anointed David king over all Israel, he was 37 years old. He took Jerusalem. He established it as his city. He built his palace. He gathered 30,000 men and went to bring the Ark of God, the visible representation of God's presence with his people, back to Jerusalem where it belonged. And then David danced. This is the moment in the entire story of David that resists being turned into a theological principle. It is just a man, a king, a person who has been through things that would have broken most people, dancing before the Lord with all his strength. The text says he was wearing a linen ephod, which was a priestly garment. He was not presenting himself as the king in that moment. He was presenting himself as a worshipper. He was leaping and dancing before the ark as it came into the city. And the whole house of Israel was bringing up the ark with shouting and with the sound of the horn. Michal, Saul's daughter, David's wife, watched from a window, and she despised him in her heart. When David came home, she said to him, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself before the eyes of his servants' female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." You can hear Saul in every word of it. The concern for dignity, the concern for what the servants thought, the reduction of a genuine moment of worship to a question of optics and whether the right people were watching and what they would say. This is what insecurity sounds like when it has learned to dress itself in the language of appropriateness. David's answer is one of the most clarifying things he ever said. It was, "Before the Lord, who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. And I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor." He was not performing for the crowd. He was not managing his image. He was responding to God. And if responding to God made him look undignified in front of people who were watching for dignity, he could live with that. He had spent enough years in enough caves to know the difference between what God thought of him and what the person in the window thought of him. The 28th lesson is the one the dancing makes undeniable. The person who has genuinely walked through the cave will worship differently than the person who came to power easily. David danced the way he did because he knew what the alternative had looked like. He had been in the cave. He had been in the field. He had been on the mountain with his feet bare and his head covered. And now the ark was coming home, and there was no version of this moment that did not require everything he had. The 29th lesson lives in his answer to Michal when the presence of God arrives. The opinion of the person in the window matters less than the reality of the one you are dancing before. Michal was looking at the crowd. David was looking at God. That difference in orientation was the same difference that had been present since the field. And it was still the thing that set him apart. God made a promise to David in the aftermath of all this. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, David told the prophet Nathan that he wanted to build a house for God. And God sent Nathan back with a response that turned the entire conversation around. "You want to build me a house? I am going to build you one. Your house, your kingdom, your throne will be established forever." It was not a promise conditioned on David's future performance. It was a promise rooted in God's own character, and it was given before the worst chapter of David's life had begun. The 30th lesson is the one this covenant teaches. God sometimes makes his most unconditional promises to people he already knows are going to fail him. The covenant was given before the roof, before Bathsheba, before Uriah, before all of it. God was not surprised by what was coming. He made the promise anyway, because the promise was never about David's perfection. It was about God's faithfulness. And then there is a sentence in the text that changes everything. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Everything in that sentence matters. The time when kings go out to battle, David remained. He was not where he was supposed to be. He was not where his history had always placed him. At the front, in the field, in the place where the calling was most directly engaged. He was comfortable. He was settled. He had everything he had ever been promised. And the having of it had, slowly and without any single dramatic decision, begun to change his relationship to the things that had kept him honest. The 31st lesson is the most dangerous one the crown teaches. And it is the one that makes everything that follows possible. Comfort does not maintain the posture of dependence that the wilderness built. It erodes it, quietly, gradually, in ways that are easy to miss until the distance has grown too large to ignore. The things that kept you grounded in the season of waiting are not automatically maintained in the season of arrival. The disciplines of the cave do not survive by inertia into the palace. They have to be actively and intentionally carried forward. And David, somewhere in the warmth of a palace that had taken decades of suffering to reach, had stopped carrying them. The crown teaches us this power does not create what is broken in a person. It gives what is broken the distance and the resources and the privacy to finally act. The dancing was real. The worship was genuine. The covenant was given. And the drift was also real. Those things can coexist in the same person at the same time. David is the proof of it. On a night when he should have been at the front, he was on a rooftop, and what happened next would cost more than anything the wilderness had ever cost him. The roof gives us 5 lessons, and every one of them arrives through the worst chapter of David's life. It began with an absence, not a dramatic departure, not a visible rejection of everything that had formed him, just a quiet, almost reasonable, almost understandable withdrawal from the place he was supposed to be. The armies were in the field. Joab was commanding. The campaign was progressing. David was in Jerusalem. And on a night when sleep would not come, he rose from his bed and walked out onto the roof of the palace. He saw a woman bathing. She was very beautiful. What happened next is one of the most examined failures in the entire Bible. And it has been taught in ways that have done real damage, ways that placed the weight of what followed on the wrong person, ways that reduced a story about the abuse of power to a story about temptation and beauty and a king who could not control himself. That reading is not only incomplete, it is dishonest about what the text actually describes. So let us be honest about it. Bathsheba was not a participant in what began that night. She was a subject. In the structure of Israelite royal society, when the king sent for you, you did not decline. There was no version of that conversation where the person being summoned had genuine options. The power differential between David and Bathsheba was not incidental to what happened. It was the mechanism by which it happened. He was the king. She was the wife of one of his soldiers. He sent messengers. She came. To read what followed as a mutual choice between 2 adults of equal standing is to ignore everything the text tells us about how power worked in that world. David is responsible for what happened. Fully, without qualification, he sent and inquired about the woman, and someone told him, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" 3 identifications. Her father's name, her husband's name. Both men were known to David. Uriah the Hittite was one of David's mighty men, listed by name among the most loyal and capable soldiers in David's army. David knew who this woman was. He knew whose wife she was. He knew whose daughter she was. The information was given to him explicitly, and it changed nothing. He sent messengers and took her. That sequence of verbs matters. Saw, took. There is no verb in between that involves her choosing. And then she returned to her house. She sent word to David, "I am pregnant." The 30-second lesson arrives right here. Before the story gets any darker, the fall rarely begins where it becomes visible. It begins in the quiet distance between who we are called to be and where we have allowed ourselves to stand. David was not on the roof because he was a bad man. He was on the roof because he had slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing, including himself, stopped going to the places that had kept him honest. The roof was not the beginning. The roof was just where it became visible. David, the man who had twice refused to take Saul's life because he would not move ahead of God's timing. The man who had built his entire story around integrity and waiting and trusting the Lord, began to maneuver. He sent for Uriah. He brought him back from the front under the pretense of receiving a battle report, and then told him to go home to his wife. The calculation was transparent. If Uriah spent the night with Bathsheba, the pregnancy could be explained. The problem would disappear. No one would have to know. Uriah did not go home. He slept at the entrance to the palace with the king's servants. When David asked him why, Uriah said this: "The ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house, to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live, and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." Uriah was articulating the exact standard that David had abandoned. The armies were in the field. The ark was in the field. The men were sleeping in the open. How could he go home to comfort while his brothers were at war? He would not do it. He was living by the code that David had built his reputation on. The 33rd lesson is the one Uriah teaches without knowing it. Integrity does not negotiate with circumstance. Uriah was in Jerusalem, away from the front. With every human reason to go home and rest, he refused. Because the standard was the standard, regardless of whether anyone was enforcing it. David had once been that man. The cave had built that man, and the palace had slowly, quietly, given that man reasons to make exceptions. David tried again. He kept Uriah in Jerusalem another day. He invited him to dinner and made him drink until he was drunk. And still Uriah did not go home. He slept on his couch with the servants of his lord. David had run out of options that did not require him to cross a line he had never crossed before. He wrote a letter to Joab, and he sent it by the hand of Uriah. Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. Uriah carried the letter that ordered his own death. He delivered it faithfully, because that is who Uriah was. A man of integrity, serving a king who was no longer operating from integrity. The most loyal soldier in David's army died because his loyalty made him the perfect instrument of his own destruction. And David used it. This is the moment where the story crosses from a failure of moral courage into something darker. The sin with Bathsheba was a catastrophic abuse of power. The murder of Uriah was deliberate, calculated, executed through the military chain of command in a way that created distance between David and the direct act. But the distance was not innocence. It was the particular kind of sin that power makes available, the ability to have something done without having to be the one who does it. The 34th lesson is the hardest one the roof teaches: when you use your power to take what is not yours and then use it again to silence the evidence. You have not just sinned against a person. You have become the thing you once survived. David had watched Saul use power to protect himself at the expense of others. He had paid the price for that. He had filed it away. And now, standing in the palace that the cave had prepared him for, he was doing the same thing with a different name attached to it. Joab withdrew the troops. Uriah died. David married Bathsheba, and the text delivers what may be the most quietly devastating sentence in the entire story of David. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. God sent Nathan. Nathan came to David and told him a story. There were two men in a city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing except one small ewe lamb, which he had bought and raised, and which had grown up with him and his children. It ate from his table and drank from his cup and lay in his arms and was like a daughter to him. When a traveler came to the rich man did not take from his own flock to prepare a meal. He took the poor man's lamb. David's anger burned against that man. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die." Nathan said, "You are the man." 4 words, the most precise and devastating 4 words in the entire narrative. They landed because David had just condemned himself. Nathan had not accused him directly. He had told a story and let David's own sense of justice do the work. And when it was finished, David was standing in the center of his own verdict. What Nathan said next was not a general rebuke about moral failure. It was specific and it was covenantal. "The Lord says this to you. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, to do what is evil in his sight?" This is God speaking to the account, listing gifts, the anointing, the deliverance from Saul, the houses, the wives, the kingdom, everything that David had. And underneath every item on that list was the same question. Was it not enough? Was all of this not enough? Why did you take what was not yours to take? David said, "I have sinned against the Lord." 4 words, no explanation, no defense, no attempt to contextualize or minimize or redirect. I have sinned against the Lord. It is the shortest and most complete confession in the Old Testament. And it is the thing that separates David from Saul in the deepest possible way. When Samuel confronted Saul, Saul explained. He managed the narrative. He shifted responsibility. He acknowledged a partial failure while constructing a framework in which the failure was understandable and the overall record still deserved credit. He never got to the place David reached in 4 words, because getting there required a kind of honesty that Saul could not sustain. David got there immediately, not because he was a better person than Saul in every dimension. He clearly was not. But because something at the core of who David was, something that had been formed in the field and the cave and the years of hiding, something that all the distance of the palace had not entirely extinguished, knew exactly where to go when Nathan said, "You are the man." The 35th lesson lives in that 4-word response. The ability to receive correction without managing it is one of the clearest signs that a person still belongs to God. Saul received correction and immediately began explaining. David received correction and immediately began confessing. The difference between those 2 responses is the difference between a man whose primary loyalty is to his own image and a man whose primary loyalty is to the truth. Nathan said, "The Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die." Forgiveness came. Immediate. Real. The sin was put away. And the consequences were also real. Immediate. Coming. Both things at the same time. The forgiveness not cancelling the consequences. The consequences not making the forgiveness conditional. Both fully true. Moving forward together into what remained of David's life. The psalm the tradition has always placed in the shadow of this moment is Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. My sin is ever before me. David was not trying to move past what he had done. He was not reaching for the forgiveness as a way to stop feeling the weight of it. He was sitting in full view of it and asking God to act, not because he deserved it, but because of who God was. According to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. He was asking for the one thing that would be worse than all of it. Not the removal of consequence, not the restoration of reputation. The presence, that is what David cannot survive without. And that is what he asks for first. The 36th lesson is the one the psalm teaches. In its opening line, genuine repentance does not begin with asking God to fix the situation. It begins with asking God to fix the person. David did not open Psalm 51 with a request for the consequences to be reversed. He opened it with a request for a clean heart. He understood that the roof was a symptom. The heart was the disease. And only God could do anything about the disease. The roof teaches us this: the fall rarely begins where it becomes visible. It begins in the quiet distance between who we are called to be and where we have allowed ourselves to stand. David was not on the roof because he was a bad man. He was on the roof because he had slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing, including himself, stopped going to the places that had kept him honest. And the God who had watched him in the field, who had been with him in the cave, who had danced with him before the ark, was the same God who sent Nathan. Because the God who loves a person does not let them stay in the dark about what the dark is doing to them. This chapter gives us the final 4 lessons, and these 4 are the ones that make the whole story make sense. The hardest thing to hold is 2 things that feel like they should cancel each other out: forgiven and still living inside the consequences. These 2 realities existed simultaneously in David's house from the moment Nathan spoke and David answered. God had forgiven him. The relationship was restored. The psalm had been written. The confession had been made. And the word of the prophet was still true. The sword will never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Most people, when they encounter this, try to resolve the tension by emphasizing one side. Either the forgiveness is so complete that the consequences become theologically suspect, evidence of a God who is holding a grudge rather than actually forgiving, or the consequences are so severe that the forgiveness begins to feel nominal, a technical pardon that changes nothing in practical terms. David did not have the luxury of resolving the tension. He had to live in it. And the living in it is where the most important and least discussed lessons of his life are located. The child born to Bathsheba became ill. David fasted and lay on the ground and prayed. His servants could not get him to eat or rise. He prayed for 7 days. The child died. What David did afterward surprised everyone who had been watching him grieve. He got up, he washed, he anointed himself and changed his clothes and went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went home and asked for food and ate. His servants did not understand. They said, "What is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive. But when the child died, you arose and ate food." David said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live. But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. The 37th lesson is compressed into those sentences. Grace does not eliminate grief, but it does give grief somewhere to go. David grieved fully while there was still something to pray for. And when the answer came and it was not the answer he wanted, he got up and worshipped. Not because it did not hurt, because he understood something about the relationship between prayer and outcomes that most people take decades to learn. He had prayed, God had decided, and the God who had decided was still the God who had forgiven him. Both of those things were true at the same time, and worship was the only honest response to both of them together. He went to Bathsheba, he comforted her, and she bore a son, and they called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him. Grace continued moving forward in the rubble, but the sword kept moving too. David had a son named Amnon and a daughter named Tamar. Tamar was beautiful. Amnon became consumed with her in the way that obsession masquerades as love until it gets what it wants and reveals what it actually was. He devised a plan. He pretended to be ill and asked his father to send Tamar to make food for him. And David sent her. What happened in Amnon's house that day was violent and unambiguous. He forced her, and when it was over, the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. He had her thrown out. She went to her brother Absalom's house and lived there desolate. And David heard all these things, and he was very angry. He was angry, and he did nothing. This is one of the most painful silences in the entire story. David, who had faced Goliath and Saul and the Amalekites and every external enemy with directness and courage, could not bring himself to confront the violence inside his own house. The text does not tell us exactly why David remained inactive, but it is difficult not to feel the weight of his own unresolved failure in the background. A man who had used his own power to take what was not his to take was not positioned inange, honest, internal, sense, to walk into Amnon's room and speak with moral authority about what Amnon had done. Tamar paid the price for that silence. And Absalom watched it happen and began to build something in his heart that 2 more years of David's inaction would harden into a decision. Absalom waited 2 years, and then he killed Amnon. Absalom fled. David mourned for Amnon. And then the text says something quietly devastating. David longed to go out to Absalom, for he was comforted about Amnon. Since he was dead, he missed his son. He wanted him back, but he did not call for him. 3 years Absalom lived in exile, and David did not send for him. It took the intervention of Joab to convince David to allow Absalom to return to Jerusalem. Absalom came back. David would not see him. 2 more years passed. Absalom lived in Jerusalem and did not see the king's face. He finally forced a meeting by setting Joab's field on fire, which was the action of a man who had run out of ways to get his father's attention through reasonable means. David saw him. He kissed him, and it was too late. The 38th lesson is the silence about Tamar and the distance from Absalom make unavoidable. Private sin does not stay private. It moves into the rooms you love most. The sword Nathan spoke of did not come from outside the house. It grew inside it, watered by silence and distance and the particular paralysis of a man who could not speak truth to others about things he had not fully faced in himself. Absalom was beautiful. He was charismatic. He stood at the gate of the city and listened to everyone who came with a complaint and said, "If only I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause could come to me, and I would give him justice." He was doing what David had stopped doing, being present, being accessible, hearing the people, and the people responded. He stole the hearts of the men of Israel. When the rebellion came, it came from inside the house. David fled Jerusalem on foot, all his household after him. He crossed the brook Kidron. He went up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, with his head covered and his feet bare. The man who had danced before the ark of God with all his strength, the man in the linen ephod who did not care who was watching. I was walking barefoot up a mountain, weeping, fleeing from his own son. One of the moments in this chapter that reveals the most about who David had become through all of it comes from a man named Shimei. As David was fleeing, Shimei came out and cursed him. He threw stones at him. He called him a man of blood and a worthless man. And one of David's commanders offered to go and take his head off immediately. David said, "Let him alone, and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today." There is a David in that sentence that the palace had not produced, but the cave had. The man who understood that not every injustice required an immediate response. The man who could absorb a curse in a moment of crisis and leave room for God to be doing something in it that he could not yet see. The years of being Saul's target had built something in him that was still there underneath everything the palace had layered over it. Still accessible, still functional, brought back to the surface by the weight of consequence. Absalom died in a battle that David had not wanted to happen. He had given explicit instructions to deal gently with the young man. But the battle does not always cooperate with the instructions of a grieving father. Absalom was caught in a tree by his hair, and Joab drove 3 javelins through his heart. A messenger came to David. He was sitting between the 2 gates, waiting, and the messenger said, "Good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." David said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" He had won the battle and was asking about his son. The kingdom had been preserved, and he wanted to know about the boy. And when the answer came, when he understood what had happened, he went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." There is no lesson to extract from this moment. There is only a father and his grief, and the space between what he had and what he lost, and the loss. The 39th lesson is the one the whole second half of David's life makes impossible to avoid. Forgiveness is not the erasure of consequence. It is the presence of God inside the consequence. Grace had been real. The forgiveness had been complete. And the geography of consequence was also real. David was not alone in the gate chamber. He was not alone on the Mount of Olives with his feet bare. The God who had said, "I will not take my steadfast love from him," was present in the grief as surely as he had been present in the dancing. That is not the same as things being okay. It is something harder and more honest than okay. It is the presence of a God who does not abandon the people he has forgiven, even when the consequences of what they have done are still arriving. The 40th lesson is the quietest one of all, and it is the one that carries the most weight. The thing that breaks us most completely is almost never the enemy outside. It is the distance between who we were called to be and who we became in the seasons when we stopped paying attention. Absalom was not David's enemy. He was David's son. And the grief in that gate chamber was not just the grief of a father losing a child. It was the grief of a man who could trace a straight line from a rooftop in Jerusalem to a tree in the forest of Ephraim and understand exactly how the distance between those two places was measured. The psalm and the price teach us this. Forgiveness is real and consequences are real, and the God who gives the first does not remove the second. What he does instead is something harder and better than removal. He stays. He is present in the gate chamber and on the Mount of Olives and in every broken place that the sword passes through on its way. And the person who has genuinely encountered his forgiveness will find, in the wreckage, that the presence is still there, that the steadfast love has not departed, that the God who watched them in the field is the same God watching them now. That is not a small thing. In the gate chamber, it is the only thing. There was still a chapter left, and it was the one that answered the question the whole story had been asking, since Samuel walked into Jesse's house and asked for the boy from the field. What does God call a person like this? After everything, after the field and the cave and the palace and the roof and the psalm and the grief and the years of living inside what the choices had cost, what does he call him? The phrase appears early in the story, and it never gets taken back. Samuel said it to Saul before David was even known outside of Bethlehem. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people. That was the description before the anointing, before Goliath, before the cave or the palace or the roof or the weeping on the Mount of Olives, before any of it, and God never revised it. Not after Bathsheba, not after Uriah, not after the silence about Tamar or the years of distance from Absalom or the long, complicated list of things that David did and failed to do and could not undo. The title did not come with a conditional clause. It was not a man after God's own heart unless he falls, or until he fails, or pending future review of his moral record. It was spoken before the record was complete, and it stood after the record was as complicated as a human life can get. This raises a question that matters more than it might first appear. What does it actually mean? If it means what most people assume it means, that David was a person of exceptional moral character whose heart was oriented toward righteousness in a way that set him apart from ordinary human failure, then the rest of his story makes no sense. A person of that description does not do what David did on the roof. A person of that description does not send Uriah to his death. A person of that description does not sit in silence for years while his daughter lives in desolation and his son builds toward a rebellion that will nearly end his kingdom. So it cannot mean that. And the fact that it cannot mean that is not a problem for the phrase. It is the whole point of the phrase. Go back to the original Hebrew and the context in which Samuel speaks it. The word translated as heart, lev in Hebrew, does not refer primarily to emotion in the ancient Near Eastern understanding. It refers to the center of a person's will and orientation, the place from which decisions about direction are made. When God says David is a man after his own heart, he is not making a claim about David's moral perfection. He is making a claim about David's fundamental orientation, about where the compass of David's deepest self points when everything else is stripped away. And here is what the life of David demonstrates about that orientation. Consistently, across every season, including the darkest ones, David always knew where to go. In the field, when no one was watching, he went to God in the silence and came out knowing something about God's faithfulness that could only be learned there. In the cave, when everything had been stripped away and the broken people had arrived and the future looked like it might never come, he went to God in the Psalms and came out with something to say to every generation of human beings who would ever sit in a dark place and need to know that someone had been there before them and had not been abandoned. In the moment when Nathan said, "You are the man," and the full weight of what he had done arrived in 4 words, David did not explain, did not manage, did not perform. He said, "I have sinned against the Lord," and went directly to the place he had always gone. When he was fleeing from Absalom, barefoot and weeping, and Shimei was cursing him from the hillside, he did not reach for power or revenge or even dignity. He said, "The Lord has told him to," and he left room for God to be doing something he could not see. When the battle was over and the kingdom was saved and the messenger came with good news, the first thing David asked was, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The boy. Before the victory, before the throne, the boy. A man after God's own heart does not mean a man who never went in the wrong direction. It means a man whose deepest orientation kept reasserting itself even after the worst detours. A compass that points north even when the person carrying it has walked south for a season. The compass was never broken at the core, even when the behavior said otherwise. Saul is the contrast that makes this clear. Saul also had moments of genuine emotion. When Samuel confronted him, there were moments where something real surfaced. But those moments never reached the level of David's response to Nathan, because something in Saul's orientation was ultimately pointed toward self-preservation rather than toward God. When he was exposed, his primary concern was always what this meant for his standing, his legacy, his position in the eyes of the people. He needed the crowd more than he needed God. And so even his repentance was managed in a way that David's was not. David's repentance was unmanaged. The psalm the tradition has always placed in the shadow of his confession is not a public relations document. It is a man opening the inside of himself completely before God and asking for nothing except presence and a clean heart. Not reputation, not restored standing, not the removal of consequence. The presence, the Spirit not taken away, the joy of salvation restored. He was not managing the narrative. He was bringing the wreckage directly to God without trying to make it look better than it was. That is what after God's own heart means. The heart knew where to return. There are 3 things David carried into the final chapter of his life that reveal what 40 years of reign had built in him. Not despite the suffering, but through it. The first is the Psalms themselves. David wrote songs in the field when he was nobody. He wrote songs in the cave when he was hiding. He wrote songs on the throne when he was celebrated. He wrote songs in the dust of his greatest failure. He wrote songs when he was fleeing and when he was restored and when he was old and when he was dying. The through line of his entire life was a conversation with God that never stopped, that accommodated every condition he passed through, that did not require stable circumstances or a clean record or a resolved theology of suffering to keep going. The Psalms are not primarily theological documents. Though they contain deep theology, they are relationship documents. They are evidence of a man who talked to God in every season of his life, who brought every human experience into the conversation without filtering it first, who was willing to say things to God that most people are afraid to even admit to themselves. My God, why have you forsaken me? How long, O Lord? I am exhausted with my moaning. And who then? In the same breath, or the next psalm, or the one after that, said, "But I trust in your steadfast love." He did not wait until he had it figured out before he talked to God. He talked to God in the process of trying to figure it out. And that posture The posture of a person who brings the unsorted and still bleeding parts of their experience to God without cleaning them up first is one of the most transferable things in the entire story. The second is the covenant. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, before the roof, before the consequences, God made a promise to David that was not contingent on David's future behavior. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. When he commits iniquity, God built the anticipation of David's failure into the covenant before the failure happened. He did not promise David a consequence-free life. He promised him a love that would not be taken away, even when the consequences came. He promised the discipline of a father, not the abandonment of a judge. And he promised that the dynasty, the house, the kingdom, would endure beyond David's individual performance. David did not earn that covenant by his faithfulness. He could not lose it by his failure. The covenant was God's commitment to David, rooted in God's own character. And the fullest expression of that covenant is not found in any king who came after David. It is found in the one the genealogy was always building toward. The son of David, who would also be the Son of God. The king who would sit on a throne that would not end. The one who would do what David could not. Who would hold the power without being corrupted by it. Who would give his life rather than take one to protect his position. David was not the point of the covenant. He was the beginning of it. The shadow cast by a light that was coming from somewhere beyond him. The third is a question David asked near the end of his life that most people do not know he asked. After everything, after Bathsheba and Uriah and Absalom and the long, complicated second half of his reign, after the grief and the consequences and the years of living inside what the choices had cost, David asked about Jonathan's family. Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? There was a son of Jonathan named Mephibosheth, who was lame in both feet from an accident in childhood. David had him brought from Lo-debar. The name of that place in Hebrew carries the meaning of a place of no pasture, a place of nothing. And when Mephibosheth came before David and fell on his face, David said, "Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always." Mephibosheth said, "What is your servant, that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I?" David restored his land. He gave him a place at the royal table. He seated the son of his dead friend, the grandson of the king who had spent years trying to kill him, at the same table where he ate every day. Not because Mephibosheth earned it, not because the politics required it, because of Jonathan, because of a covenant made between two young men in a field. And David had not forgotten. In a culture where new kings typically eliminated any surviving members of the previous royal family to secure their throne, David searched for one to bless. In the same city where his greatest failure had unfolded, where the consequences of the roof were still rippling through his family, David was looking for someone to show kindness to because of a promise he had made to a friend who had been dead for years. That is who David was when you looked at the whole of him. The field and the cave and the palace and the roof and the psalm and the tears on the Mount of Olives and the question about Mephibosheth and the table set in Lo-debar for a man who thought he was nothing, the whole complicated, costly, broken, repentant, Beloved thing. David died after reigning 40 years over Israel, 33 of them from Jerusalem. He had made Solomon king. He had gathered the materials for the temple he would not be allowed to build, because his hands had shed too much blood. He had written the songs that would outlast every dynasty that came after him. And he had left behind a record so honest and so human and so marked by the presence of a God who refused to stop pursuing him that every generation since has found their own experience somewhere inside it. The last recorded words attributed to David before his death speak of a ruler who dawns on his people like the morning light, like the sun shining forth on a cloudless morning, like rain that makes grass sprout from the earth. He was describing something he had only partially been. He knew the gap between the ideal and the record. He had lived in that gap for decades. And he was still singing about the morning light because he had seen enough of God's character to know that the morning light was real, even when the clouds were present. The sweet psalmist of Israel. That is what he called himself at the end. The one who kept singing, who kept going back to God with the unsorted and the unresolved, who kept setting the table for the people nobody else remembered, who kept asking, "Is there anyone left that I might show kindness to?" That is who God called a man after his own heart. And if that is what the phrase means, then it is the most hopeful thing in the entire Bible, because it means the title is not reserved for the person who has the cleanest record or the most impressive resume of faithful decisions. It is available to the person who, regardless of what their record looks like, keeps pointing their face back toward God every time they look up from the ground. Every time. In the cave, and on the roof, and on the Mount of Olives, and in Lodebar. Every time the compass has a chance to reassert itself. It points back. That is what David was. That is what after God's own heart means. The most important question that the entire story of David leaves sitting in the room is not about David at all. It is about you. Every person watching this has a roof somewhere in their story. A moment when the distance between where they were supposed to be and where they ended up became visible in a way they could not manage. A Nathan moment. A Psalm 51 moment. A moment when everything they had built looked like it was going to cost them everything they loved. The question is not whether that moment happened. The question is what you did when Nathan said, "You are the man." Whether you explained or whether you confessed. Whether you reached for cover or whether you went directly to the only place that has ever been able to do anything with the actual weight of what you are carrying. The question is whether the compass still works. David's story says yes. 9 chapters, 40 lessons, 1 life, all of it pointing toward the same place. God does not use perfect people. He uses people whose compass keeps working even when they have been walking the wrong direction. People who know where to go when Nathan arrives. People who can find the address even from a mountain outside Jerusalem with their feet bare and their head covered. And if you are still breathing, the address has not changed. The door has not closed. The table is still set. Somewhere in the lineage of the promises God made to a shepherd boy in a field outside Bethlehem. A promise that outlasted every failure and every consequence and every complication that David's very human life could produce. Somewhere in that lineage is a king who came for exactly the person you are right now. He has not forgotten where he put you. He never forgot David in the field. He did not forget him in the cave. He did not stop calling him a man after his own heart when the record got complicated. And he is not finished with you. That is not the end of the lesson. That was always the whole lesson. God does not quit on repentant people. If something in this video reached a place that does not usually get reached, I want to ask you to do 3 things before you close out. Subscribe if you have not already and turn on notifications. This channel exists for one reason: to take the people of Scripture seriously enough to tell the truth about them. The complicated truth. The uncomfortable truth. The truth that makes the grace mean something because it does not sand down the edges of what actually happened. Share this with one person. You already thought of someone while you were watching. Someone who is in their cave right now and needs to know that the cave is not the end of the story. Someone who has a complicated record and has started to wonder if that disqualifies them from what God said about their future. Send it to them. Do not overthink it. Just send it. Leave a comment and tell me which chapter hit hardest. Was it the field? The cave? The roof? The psalm? The table set for Mephibosheth? I read every comment and I want to know where you are in this story. Because wherever you are, someone else is in the same place. And that is worth knowing. We will see you in the next one.